It's really quite astonishing how often one can hear that story, even in those exact words. And still there's this extraordinary power there. Master says whenever a master is anywhere, that the vibrations of his consciousness remain there forever. And there is some living power to Scripture that makes it so much more than any sort of intellectual or rational or just sort of this world appraisal of it. You can't evaluate. I know I've puzzled over this for years and years and years. Excuse me a moment. Been in this church since 1994, September of 1994. I think most of the time since that time we've done an Easter service, something like this, maybe Easter, Good Friday. I can't really remember when we started it, but it's been a long time. And of course, one reads the Bible in between and hears this music and thinks about it. But there's no explanation except God, because it so far transcends anything, everything else. And just the story of how Jesus came, greater could no love be than this, from a life of infinite joy and freedom in God, willingly to embrace limitation, pain, and death for the salvation of mankind. Such ever has been the sacrifice of the great masters for the world. Here then is the fourth and last stage of the soul's long journey, the redemption. And this is what Jesus is offering to us, is a perfect example of the end of the journey that we're all on, where self is insignificant compared to the opportunity to serve. Many of you know that I spent the month of January this year, seems like an eon ago now, the month of January in Israel. I was one of the leaders of two different pilgrimages that were essentially back to back. They were sort of, almost you might say, private, because they were all for just Ananda devotees. So we were a unified group of meditating yogis, two different groups, one from India, one from America. And in the course of that extraordinarily privileged month, I spent many, many days in Jerusalem, and 4 times walked the Via Dolorosa, as it's called, the Way of Sorrows, which is the walk that Jesus took from the time, as Helen was reading, that he was condemned by Pontius Pilate. The cross was put on his back, and he walked the route from the Praetorium to Golgotha, the hill where he was crucified and died. Now, of course, this is Good Friday. Then there's Saturday. Then there's Sunday morning, and Sunday morning is Easter. And Sunday morning is when Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb and discovers that the tomb is empty, because Jesus has in fact resurrected his body and appears to the disciples just as he was before he died. So even though we know the end of the story, the drama of this part of it, for the power of selflessness and the complete unconcern for personal suffering, if that suffering can serve for others. His suffering served for others in multiple ways. One was simply, as traditional Christianity speaks, Jesus died for our sins. And because of his sacrifice, our salvation is assured. That's a complicated theological point, which I won't bother to explore in all its aspects. But this is certainly one part of it. Jesus was and is Guru. Guru to all those who feel called by God to make their pathway to God through that particular incarnation of the divine. In traditional earth, by the call of aspiring love. Your chosen people have always been those of every race and nation who with deep love chose thee. A prayer of love went up from earth and Jesus responded. A prayer of love goes up from earth every moment of every day. A prayer of love goes up from our hearts. And the power of God descends through the night skies of our consciousness and comes to us to inspire us to choose that love. And for Jesus, that unique incarnation in which his sacrifice is the central story, he showed us a possibility for ourselves that is too magnificent and in certain ways too frightening, but nonetheless must be faced, which is ultimately there is nothing that matters except our devotion and our surrender to God. That's what Jesus was saying. Pontius Pilate says to him, "Are you a king?" Jesus said, "If my kingdom was of this world, my disciples would have defended me with the force of this world." And in that moment when Jesus was being taken, Peter couldn't contain himself, and he pulled out a sword and attacked the one who was taking Jesus and actually injured him by cutting off his ear. But Jesus stopped him, because the kingdom of Jesus is not of this world. We think of force against force, violence against violence, that we must defend ourselves and stand up. And there is truth in that. There is a time and a place for that. But Jesus was showing us a much greater power. So Jesus restored the severed ear. And then when he's standing in front of Pilate, he says, "My kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is of the power of God." And Jesus is knowing that they're going to humiliate him. Humiliation is not a small thing to happen. They took him back where the crowd couldn't see him, and they beat him, and they mocked him, and they put a crown of thorns because he was a king. There was pain in those thorns, and there was humiliation in that, and they put a purple robe around him. Then they dragged him out in front of the multitude who had been plied with liquor and money to demand the crucifixion of Jesus, and he had to stand there and accept it. But he said, "Even now, my Father could send legions of angels to rescue me. But for this hour was I born, because I'm here not to show you worldly power. I'm here to show you that the power of God can triumph over everything." Now, how would it feel to be that certain? That's what the story of Jesus' life is about. Trying to ask ourselves, how would it feel to be that certain and that unafraid, that confident in God's loving power that we can surrender completely and not even ask him to rescue us. Why would we want to be rescued from that which is leading to so much glory? And being in Israel and walking where Jesus walked, and they have this practice that was actually developed by St. Francis, I believe, where we take ourselves in the footsteps of Jesus and walk that route. They call it the Stations of the Cross, in which Well, in the physical realm of Jerusalem, you actually literally walk, and there's markers at each of these places where various things of significance happened to Jesus on the way to being crucified. He fell under the weight of the cross. 3 times he fell. And that's every part of the life of Christ, of course, was divinely orchestrated. Nothing that happened except for the perfection of the expression of surrender. And 3 times he fell. And in the 4 times that I walked that and shared it with my devotee friends, I thought how many more times than 3 we've all fallen. The cross was very heavy, and Jesus was weakened, and he was being mocked, and he could feel the pain of everyone around him in all these different ways. He could feel the pain of wrong action by those who had succumbed to the delusion that he needed to be killed, or actually implementing that sentence. Later, when he was crucified, he prayed, "Father, forgive them," which is what Helen was reading, this greatest miracle of compassion, that even those who were torturing him, all Jesus could think of was what they were going to have to suffer. And he interceded, "Father, forgive them." Just as his entire sacrifice was the Guru taking upon himself, using his physical body in this case, to literally take upon himself the karma of his disciples. And right after the crucifixion, when he was resurrected, his disciples were lifted up in the spirit. And Master said it was because Jesus himself worked out much of their karma. The karma it's so subtle and so complicated, but that's what a master can do. Karma that is intended for his disciples, he simply takes it upon himself, and he absorbs whatever the blow it might have been. And then the disciple is freed to that extent. After his body was gone, Jesus still takes the karma of his disciples, but he does it by non-physical means. But Jesus fell 3 times under the strain of that, and he fell for our sake, because even in that moment, legions of angels could have rescued him. But he fell so that we would understand. You fall. We are surrendered to God. We have given our lives to God. We have affirmed with every meditation, "Lord, I am here. Make me thine. Lord, I am thine. Be thou mine. I have made thee pole star of my life." But still we fall. But every time Jesus rose again, and in various ways, he was helped. Simon, a strong man who was standing by the side, was pressed into service by the guards to help Jesus carry the cross. And I'm sure many stories have been written about who Simon was and how he came to be there. But what a glorious moment for Simon. How many times we want to pay God back for all the grace he has showered upon our head. And here Simon literally could lift the burden from the shoulders of the Master and carry it for him. Beautiful. And all that had to happen for Simon to be standing right there when Jesus fell, so that he could lift the cross from him. And there is Simon, an example of the absolute willingness to serve God in whatever way God asks of us. And Jesus met his mother, and Mary and Jesus were partners in that mission, which is why Mary has been so active in the world, especially now. Mary has been appearing in so many places in the world in the last couple of centuries, and is still appearing. There are many visionaries in the world who see Mary every day, every week, every month. For 30 years in Medjugorje, Mary has been coming back to these visionaries. With predictable regularity, they know she will come. So here's Jesus going through the last stages of this incarnation that came through the body of Mary. I've never carried a child, but I've heard mothers say to their children, I carried you under my heart. So Mary carried Jesus, miraculous conception, but nonetheless she carried him. She nurtured him, she nourished him and cared for him as a baby. Now he stands before her, a grown man, and she knows who he is. And she knows he must do what he has to do. But oh my, how a mother's heart must have grieved. But I always think of it, Jesus looking at Mary and Mary looking at Jesus, and both of them knowing. And rather than allowing her grief to weaken him, she would use her strength to give him the strength to go on. I remember once when Swamiji was struggling to complete a task he had assigned to himself. I encouraged him. I said, it's a deadline you set for yourself. We can shift it. He said, get thee behind me, Satan. That's what he said to me. He said, I've set my will for this. And later it came more clear. If you are my friend, help strengthen my will, don't take it away from me. That experience with Swami came back to me when I thought of Mary and Jesus, and I thought of Mary's true, selfless love for Jesus, where her concern for her own grief could not possibly have intruded. He was born for this, and her role as his mother was to give him every ounce of love she had, so he could carry it through with perfection. And how Jesus must have drawn on her strength. And then the disciples drew on Mary's strength later. And we as devotees draw on Mary even now. There was another station of the cross where Jesus met, the way they put it is, Jesus met the women of Jerusalem. There's different interpretations. It's very interesting in Jerusalem itself. There are these beautiful, I think they're cast iron sculptures. They're not large, they're like this big, but they're really beautifully done of figures describing each scene so that as you see it, you have something you can concentrate on. And in all of them, Jesus is carrying the cross, and he's sort of bent over. It's beautiful art, but you can feel that. Then when he meets the women of Jerusalem, he's just sort of standing up straight and talking to them. Not exactly kind of holding the cross casually, but a completely different mood. It's an artist's interpretation, who can say? But he comforted those women. He comforted them. And some say he gave them advice. He spoke to them. No doubt they were his disciples, seeing him for the last time. And he blessed them. And he assured them, as he undoubtedly did, that what you see looks painful, but not to my spirit. When Ramakrishna was dying of throat cancer, terribly painful, one of his devotees was sitting with him and was trying to sympathize with Ramakrishna, but the longer the devotee sat there, the more blissful he felt. And he finally looked at Ramakrishna and they communed. And Ramakrishna says, you've discovered my secret. So undoubtedly, those who had the capacity could see the many different levels on which Jesus was living. And he gave to those women. Then he was burdened again. And there's a place where Saint Monica came out of her house and she took her own garment like this and she wiped his face. Now bear in mind, there's armed soldiers, the mob is screaming, everyone is impassioned. This has been building for such an enormous amount of time, and now finally it's all come to a head. She saw none of that. She saw her Lord suffering, and she walked out with her own scarf and just wiped his face. And the scarf was impressed with the face of Jesus. Now, would I have had that courage? Would you have had that courage? In the midst of all of that? To think only, how can I comfort him? I would like to think so, but I can't say for sure. But we walk with Jesus and we get to ask ourselves, would I have been strong enough to carry the cross? Would I have been as generous as his mother? Would I have been as courageous as Monica was? And then, of course, Jesus comes to the final place of Golgotha, and they strip him of his clothes and they nail him to the cross. And Mary Magdalene and Mary, his mother, and John are standing there. Everyone else is very, very frightened. They were not able to be there with him. The other disciples, they couldn't do it. They didn't abandon Jesus, but it was all too much. You know, even Peter, they tell the story, the Last Supper Jesus predicted. Jesus is saying to his disciples at the Last Supper, I am going where you cannot follow. And Peter, who had such a bold personality, said, I will go with you wherever you go, Lord. What do you mean? Jesus just looked at him and said 3 times before the dawn comes and the rooster crows, the cock crows, you will deny that you are even my disciple. And that precisely happened. In the chaos and the fear of the moment, 3 times. Peter was asked if he was his disciple, but Peter didn't know, will I be arrested? Will I be crucified if I say yes? And in his panic, he denied that he even knew Jesus. And then the last time, he hears the sound of the rooster crowing. And he came out of that delusion. And then later proved his loyalty again and again and again. And just to finish that, when Jesus was resurrected by the Sea of Galilee, and this is for 40 days after Jesus' resurrection, he appeared here and there and here and there. It wasn't just Easter morning and then he was gone for 40 days. He was appearing from time to the disciples, and he came to Peter. And he said to Peter, Jesus said to Peter 3 times, do you love me? And each time Peter was able to say, yes, Lord, I love you. So all the karma comes to 0. Everything is balanced. But Jesus is there on the cross. And the disciples, even to the end, how will this end? And the last thing Jesus does, is he gives the care of his mother to the disciple John. And it says in the Bible, from that point, John kept Mary as his own mother in his home. And then Jesus knew he'd done everything that he came to do. And death by crucifixion apparently takes a little longer, as a rule. But in the case of Jesus, he was finished, and he said, it is finished. Now, also what is so magnificent there, all of us will have an hour of death. All of us will have a moment of death. The last inhalation, followed by the last exhalation, and then the stillness and the silence of the soul having exited. I've sat next to a number of people and I've heard that last inhalation And then that last exhalation. And then it's over. So Jesus has gone through this magnificent saga. And he's played his part perfectly. And he is able to say, it is finished. Every word Jesus spoke had so much power. At the end of our incarnation, when, however, that end comes, we will be able to raise our consciousness to the spiritual eye, to call upon the Guru as Jesus did, Elias, Elijah, he called for his Guru. He's calling for Elijah, they said. Yes, he is, because Elijah was his Guru in the last hour. We call, the consciousness goes to God, to the one who has brought us to God, which is the Guru. We look into the spiritual eye, we see the entire saga of the incarnation, and we can say, it is finished. And then Jesus gave up the ghost. He gave up the spirit. Willingly, by his own will, not by the expiration of his physical form. But it was done. And then he exhaled for the last time. And his incarnation was finished. Oh, what a glorious story. And why would we settle for less? Whether in this life or a few lifetimes from now, that which I do, Jesus said, ye shall do, and greater things. This was a promise to all who received him. So let us receive him. All together, at this point we would invite those who feel inclined to take part in the purification ceremony. But merely because we're separated from one another physically doesn't mean that we can't still participate in the spirit of what the purification ceremony is. Swamiji created this at the same time as the festival many years ago. And the purification ceremony is an affirmation of the fact that our true nature is divine, and all we have to do is be freed from those things which shadow that divinity. That the gold of our spirit is untouched by delusion, no matter how long the gold is buried in the mud. When the mud is washed off, the gold of our true nature shines through without the slightest blemish. And the power that washes away that delusion and confusion is the grace of the God and the Gurus. So in the purification ceremony, many of you know, we often have the opportunity to take a piece of paper and to write upon it something that we wish to energize. We want to energize it, either a virtue we wish to develop or a limitation we wish to dissolve. If you have a piece of paper close to you, may write, or just write upon your heart how you would like to be blessed by God. And in the ceremony then, and let us now visualize and feel that in the spirit this is what we are doing. The light bearers of the Ananda Sangha would be sitting on this altar as representatives, as living representatives of the masters. But it's the power of the Gurus shining from the altar behind me, and especially on this occasion, the liberating power of Jesus Christ. and holding in our hands or holding in our hearts that unique prayer that we're asking of God. We kneel before the light bearer, and we're not kneeling to the person, we're kneeling to the masters behind. And the purpose of kneeling is to offer ourselves, to relinquish the self-importance of our height and to bring ourselves as an offering into the Spirit. We kneel before the light bearer and you say, I seek purification by the grace of God. So repeat that out loud or in silence. I seek purification by the grace of God. Then the light bearer speaks in the voice of the gurus. The master says, open your heart to me, and I will enter and take charge of your life. Oh, what a promise. The master says, open your heart to me, and I will enter and take charge of your life. Now we meditate together for a moment. Repeating our self-offering, receiving the Master's promise. Then the light bearer further creates the connection from the altar to the devotee, touching the disciple at the heart chakra. The hand of the light bearer is not needed because it's the hand of the Master, touching at the heart chakra. Feel the touch. Then the light bearer declares, by the grace of our masters, you are free. By the grace of our masters, you are free. Then the devotee physically or in your heart, go to the altar and take whatever it is that you are asking for and place it on the altar. And if we were together, it would be burned and released into the infinite. And so it is. So let us now close with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, we offer ourselves humbly at thy feet. Bless us with courage, devotion, perseverance. Guide our footsteps till we find our home in Thee. Om. Peace. Amen.
When we need you, you descend, seeking grieving hearts to mend. By hate unaffected, you remain our friend. On a cross rejected, doomed to meet a shame.